Hey guys, welcome to episode 3 of the React crash course. In the previous episode we covered JSX and how it renders. We looked at how we can use data and functions in JSX, and we looked at how to style the code. In this episode we're going to look at creating components, which is one of the biggest benefits of using a framework like React. We're going to look at exporting and importing components, and then we'll look at static props, dynamic props or data props, and function props. This episode is where your application's really going to come to life. So let's get into it. Now, if you followed along on the previous episode, this is where you would end up. And you can see we've got some warnings showing in our terminal window. So we're going to go ahead and just clean up some of this code. I'm going to remove line 6, and I'm going to remove this function that we placed. We'll remove my style, and we'll get rid of the inline style from our header div. If I just hit save, so you should then have a black background with white text, because that's what we've set in our app.scss file. Now, in order to create a component, components can be created either as functions or as classes. Classes is really the old way of using React, and so we're not going to cover this in this tutorial, but you could go ahead and Google React classes if you want to find out more. Instead, we're going to use functions. So just outside of our app component, we're going to create a new function, and I'm going to use constants with fat arrows, and we'll call it header equals fat arrow. There we go. And we'll return a div with a class name of header, and then inside of that we'll pop our h1 tag, and we'll write my header for now and hit save. Now at the moment we've defined this component, but we're not using it anywhere. So we'll go ahead and remove our div with a class of header from our app component, and we'll import it just like an HTML tag. So header, and if we hit save, there we go, my header is showing. And that's the basics of creating a component in React. Now, one thing to note here is it must start with a capital letter, and generally you would use camel case. So we would, for example, use header element with a capital E. If we were to not use a capital letter and just put header with a small h and try and import that in and hit save, nothing will happen. And we'll get this warning, header is assigned a value but never used. So we've assigned header this function, but as far as React's concerned, we've not used it. And that's because React will only read components with a capital letter at the beginning. So we'll go back and put a capital H in. In fact, while we're here, we'll just remove line 14 as well and hit save, and you can see there in the terminal all of our warnings have disappeared. It's worth keeping an eye on the terminal because the warnings can get a bit out of control if you don't clean them up. So that's a basic header component that's being poured into our app component. But this isn't much use because the header component at the moment is only available within app.js, and we probably would want to use it across the whole app. So what we'll do is inside of the source directory is we'll create a new folder, and we'll call it components. And inside of that component folder, we'll create a new file called header, and we'll give it a capital letter at the beginning, .js. And there we have an empty JS file. If we pull our header component from the app.js and pop that into here, hit save, and hit save on this, we're going to get the error that header is not defined because app.js no longer has access to this header component. Now, before we import that header component into this app.js file, we need to head back over to our new header component file, and we can export this component in two ways. The first is to just write export. So we're now telling React that this function as a component is exported from this file, and that allows us then to import this into app.js. Now, the second thing you can do is you can write export default header. Header. And I'll explain what's going on here in a moment. If we head back over to our app.js file, we can now write at the top import header from /components/header and hit save, and you'll see our header is back. Now, the reason it knows it's called header is because in our header.js file we've set export default header. If we were to comment out that line and hit save, we're going to get the error export default imported as header was not found. It can't find this header component in the file because it's not exported by default. The best way to think about how these components are exported from files is that they're going to pass back an object of everything that's exported. And on that basis, we could go ahead and deconstruct that object by putting curly brackets around header, and then it's fine. Generally, you're just going to use the export default function. I'll remove those curly braces. The only time really you would want to use the curly brackets and export multiple components from one file is if, for example, we created a structure component, and inside of that constructor component file we had headers, sidebars, footers, all exported from that one file to keep the code in one place. We could then export the sidebar, for example, by default, but still import the header and the footer. So that's our header component being pulled into our app.js file and rendering on the screen. But this file isn't much use at the moment because we have a static header of my header. And it might well be if you were building an app that had multiple pages, you would want to pass through a different h1 tag depending on the page you were on. So what we'll do is we'll head back to our app.js and we're going to pass through what's called a prop. So we can say title, and this prop name can be anything you like, equals curly brackets, and we'll pop in there my header. Hit save. In fact, my header. In fact, we'll change that to be team app so you can see it change. So we're now passing through a prop called title. Again, title is what we've decided to call it, and we've put the title as team app. So that prop is now being passed through to our header component, but at the moment we're not receiving in that prop. And there's two ways you can receive props into your components. One is to just write props, and then inside of here we'll replace my header with some curly brackets because we're going to output data into our component, and we could say props.title and hit save, and there you go, team app is now showing in the header because that's what we're passing through from our app.js file. The second way would be to deconstruct these props being passed through, and props are passed through as an array of props with key value pairs. So we could just change that to deconstructing the props and say title, in which case we won't need the word props. And if we hit save, again, that's absolutely fine. And I can show you by just changing the text there, and that updates straight away. Now, it's kind of personal preference as to whether you receive the whole props and then use them by prefixing your objects with props dot, or if you deconstruct it. Personally, I prefer to deconstruct it because as your application gets bigger, it's quite easy to forget which props you're passing through to your components. And so if they're deconstructed, we can see straight away that it's only title available here, as opposed to needing to go back to our app.js and find out which props we've passed through. So hopefully all of that makes sense, but just to cement that knowledge, we'll go ahead and create another component, and we'll call it team member.js. Hit enter. So we're going to export const team member, and we're going to return a function, and inside of here return div with a class name of team member, and inside of team member we're going to output an H1 with their name, and we'll output an H4 with the department they work in. So let's put name in there for now. We'll get this imported into our app.js. So it's simply import team member from components / team member. Now you can notice this has automatically put the curly brackets around it because we haven't exported it by default. So let's just fix that. Export default team member. And then if we go back to our app.js, we can remove this line and start again. Team, and you'll see now it's not using the curly brackets because it knows it's exported by default. And if we export our team member onto the page and hit save, you can see we've got name and department, which is being pulled from our team member component. Now let's go ahead and just add some styles to that team member. So dot team member, and we'll say the background color is a light grey, and we'll give it some padding, and we'll give it a margin, and then we'll make the H4 text there we go. So now we've got our first team member. I'll just change that padding slightly. There we go. So that's our first team member outputting into the page. Now again, we can go back to our app.js and we can say actually we want to pass through some props. So we could say their name is John and their department is development, and hit save. Again, we're passing these props through to the team member component, but we're not doing anything with them. So we can deconstruct those props, and we're going to receive name and department, and we can then output that data, again using curly brackets, into our output. Hit save, and there we go. So just to recap, we've got a team member component with the props of name and department, and the team member component is receiving name and department and is using them on the page. Now we could quite simply output multiple team members and change the name, Sally in finance and Dave in management, and hit save, and there we go. We now have 3 team members outputting into the page. But this would be quite intensive, and ultimately we're going to want to read this information from data and then iterate through each team member. So let's go ahead inside of our function component and create a data object. So we'll say const team members equals, and it's going to be an array of objects. So we'll say the ID is 1, the name is John, and the department is development. We'll add a couple more. ID 2, name Sally, department finance, and a third ID 3, name Dave, department management. There we go, and hit save. So now all we need to do in order to use this team members object is to remove the static team member components, and we'll use curly brackets, and inside of there we'll say team members dot map, and we'll receive the team member item and the index of the array, fat arrow, and we'll return a team member. And again, we want to pass through the props name and department to this team member. So we'll say name equals t.name, and the department equals t dot department. So if we hit save, we'll see there our team members are still showing on the screen. If we make a change to this, you can see the update in the browser. So we've now got a data object of team members, and we're iterating through each team member and generating or outputting a team member component. But you'll notice in the console log, if we inspect and hit console, that we've got a warning, and it says each child in the list should have a unique key prop. And so we'll need to add key equals, and there's two things we could use for the key. We could either use the ID that we're setting for the team members, or because we've pulled through the index of the array, and we could change that to index, we could pop the index in there. It doesn't matter which one you use, but the key of each list item needs to be a unique variable. So if we hit save and refresh the page, that's now disappeared. So we've covered adding our header component, and we've covered adding a component for a team member. But because we're defining the team members inside of this app.js file, which is absolutely fine, it means that this file could grow really, really large really quickly if we were setting all of our data objects inside of the app.js. So to give you a third example of creating a component, we're going to go ahead in the components folder and create a new file called team members.js, and we'll export const team members equals, and in here we're going to first copy over our data object. So we'll remove that from the app.js. If I hit save, you can see now it's broken because team members isn't defined. We'll pop that data object into our team members component, and then we will return, and we'll pull this code here, copy that, paste that into here. Now, we didn't need to put curly brackets because data is the first thing we're returning. If we were, for example, to wrap this in an empty fragment or a div, we would need to pop a curly bracket around here, but we'll undo that because we're not needing to pull a curly bracket. In fact, let's do it. Let's put a div with a class name of team members, and then we'll need to pop some curly brackets around this in order for it to work. And the Intel sense really gives you a good idea if you've got any problems before you hit save. So again, we've still got the error because our app.js, in fact, we'll just enter export default team members, and then we'll tidy up this error in our app.js. So we can now remove this code, and we're not currently importing team members. In fact, we need to import this into team member, so we need to remove our team member import in the app.js and pop that in here. There we go. We just need to change the directory of the import. In fact, it would be easier if we import from scratch so that you can see team member from team member, and then we're using the team member component here. So we've now removed the data and the team member component from our app.js, and all that's left to do is to import our team members component and hit save, and we can see that our team members are outputting again back into our app. The final thing I want to cover in this episode is passing functions through as props. So if we head over to our team member component and add a button below our H4, and we'll say delete me and hit save. Again, this is just the equivalent of an HTML tag, and we can see we now have a button that says delete me. Now if we put in fact what we'll do is we'll put an on click in here equals, and notice that it's on click in camel case, not on click all lowercase like you would in HTML. And inside of this on click, we're going to call a function that we've not defined yet, but we'll call it delete team member and hit save. Now we're going to work backwards, so we want to pass a prop through to this team member of delete team member. Now all of a sudden the app isn't erroring because delete team member has been defined. And then the final thing we need to do is pass a function through as a prop to the team member from our team members component. So again, we'll say, pop it in here, so say delete team member equals delete team member. And if we hit save, we'll get an error because we've not defined delete team member. So above our return, we'll create a function called delete team member equals, and for now we'll just console log deleting team member. So I worked backwards there, so just to recap what we've done is in our team members component we've created a function called delete team member, and we're going to do nothing more than just console log out that we're deleting a team member. We're then taking that function and we're passing it through to our team member component. So not only can you pass static text through to components, you can pass data, as we're doing with the name and the department of the team member item, but you can also pass through functions. And when your child component calls that function, it's going to pass itself back up to its parent component, find the function and execute it. Now we could have called this just delete, we could have called it anything, but I tend to try and use the same names for my prop functions as I do the actual function. Makes it much easier to understand what you're doing as you move down through child components. So if we go to our team member component, we're pulling in delete team member, the function, and on click of our button we're calling that delete team member function. So if we go ahead and refresh the page, we're in the console, I hit delete and we can see delete team member. Now what we could do is we could go back to our team members component and we could say we want to know which team member you want to delete. So we could receive the index from the array of team members. In fact, no, what we'll do is, because we're setting an ID, so we'll receive the ID into this function and we'll say deleting team member and we'll print out the ID of the team member. So back to our team member component, once we call this onClick, we want to pass through the ID of this team member. Now there are two things to note here. One, we're going to be passing parameters through to this function, so we need to call it within an empty function component. So we'll do that and then we'll pass through the ID. Now you probably will have noticed that this error is because we're not receiving ID into this component, and this raises an important point. It could well be that this team member is going to receive lots of information to output: the name, the department, their start date, their salary, their job description. There could be tons of props. So instead of passing through each prop independently, we'll head back over to our team members and we'll say, instead of name and department, we'll say T for team member equals T. And again, we could call this team member, we could call it team, we could call it person, but we'll say T equals, and then we're going to pass through the whole item from this array through to our child component. So heading back to the child component team member, we're now going to receive, instead of name and department, we're going to receive T for the team member, and then we'll just need to update these data items, t.name and t.department, and then we have access to the t.id, and if we hit save, it's running fine. So now in theory, when we click the button, we're going to call the delete team member function. Again, it's being passed through as a prop. We're going to give it the ID of the team member we want to delete, and in our parent component we're going to call this function and output deleting team member and their ID. So let's go ahead and click the button. There we go, deleting team member 1, deleting team member 2, deleting team member 3. So that's given you a run through of props and components and dynamic props and data and passing through functions and passing back up functions to the parent component. But at the moment, what we can't do is actually delete the team member because our team member's object is static. So in the next episode, we're going to look at state and how you can use something called useState to manage, create and manipulate data in a React app.